Welcome to the Do Good Work podcast. Today, we have an exciting episode with Annissa Deshpande. Annissa is a former HR executive of a Fortune 500 company where she oversaw the hiring of 20,000 people in 150 countries annually. 20,000. If you thought you hired a lot, think again. 20,000 is a lot of people. And she designed internal talent initiatives to achieve business results, outcomes. That's the key word here. So while most of HR programs are heavily focused on compliance, Annissa has a different take on HR. She helps teams think bigger, align to business goals, and results with great experiences for their employees. She's modernizing HR with her practices, and she founded lōglab in 2015, which combines her 20 plus years of experience in finance, IT, and strategies to help companies, pretty much the modern entrepreneur, modernize their HR teams to grow revenue and create a great place where people love to work. And I couldn't agree more with that mission statement. In today's episode, you'll learn about Annissa's take on HR, why it needs to be modernized, as well as a framework that'll allow you to identify the programs that you can develop, not the exact ones, but how to create the framework to identify what your company, what your team needs today. So you'll get that in today's episode as well as a really amazing resource that Annissa offers at the end of the podcast. Again, this is Raul Hernandez. It's an honor to be a part of your journey here. Hope you enjoyed today's episode and do good work. Annissa, thank you so much for being on.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk about people, HR, growth, modernizing it, but I have to tell you a quick story. So, I have the good fortune to be able to lead teams, lead people, and help them develop. And as I work either with performance reviews, quarterly reviews, people development, there is a certain level of empathy and a certain level of care that I see, at least for me personally, that to really develop someone, it's way more than just an investment of checking off a couple boxes and saying that you're exceeding or you meeting expectations. There is a certain next layer of really helping this person shine, because the work that we do, yes, you have an output for the client or your service or your product, but also the people behind that work, we're impacting their lives, we're impacting their livelihood, we're impacting their self-image, we're impacting how they show up to work every day and how they see themselves in the mirror in some way or another, not directly, but sometimes indirectly. And it kind of dawned on me, like, I don't understand how some leaders can just see people as working capital and not really investing time to help them grow. That's kind of like my perspective with HR, is kind of being able to put that into a process and identify how do we actually do that? How we actually help a person grow and not losing sight of the growth of the business, because everything has to grow together. Like the people have to grow, business has to grow, because without the business, there are no people. But I kind of want to get if you can help me succinct that, like, what is your take on HR and how do we really help people grow both business and development?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great I think it's a great story, and I think it's an interesting tidbit because you do realize that people come to work and it's like they forget how to be people. Like I sometimes get questions like, "Oh, can you help me build a one-on-one template that helps our managers check in with how employees are doing?" And it's like, do you go home at night and talk to your family about, how they're doing? Do you talk to your friends about how they're doing? Why is it different when you come to work? And we have to kind of get over that notion of being human, having conversations. It's just part of being a good person, and doing the things that you do normally in your life and applying it to work. So I always find that really interesting how people struggle with that and how leaders also don't see people as people, but rather working capital, or even the term human capital is one I actually don't like because it takes away the human aspects, the people aspects of it. But to answer your question, I view HR as a function which, when you modernize it, can have a lot of benefit for the company. And so I think of modern HR as a function that grows revenue and creates a place where people love to work. And that's quite different from the traditional HR mindset. So this is really moving away from that cost center type environment to how do we build programs and practices that really align what we're trying to do from a people perspective to the business. And so I've had the good fortune prior to starting my own company to work for a company that really believed in that. So everything we did from performance management to succession planning was all tied to how do we take these programs and really use it to drive the business forward.
I love that, and I have to ask the silly question, but why modernize it? What are we modernizing, and why does it need to be modernized? Just to make it a little bit more clear, because I mean, I completely agree with you. I'm growth focused, I'm revenue focused, I'm expansion focused, but I also want to make sure not the expense of the people. What is the where do leaders need to see what needs to be modernized?
Yeah, so I think HR has traditionally had a mindset of compliance, right? It's built around this whole thing of we got to make sure we're following all the laws. We got to make sure we don't get in trouble. And I think this is a little bit why people struggle to have human conversations in the workplace is that HR has all these rules and regulations about what you say and what you can't say. And so I'm not saying that compliance isn't important, but when you're doing the right things as a company, right? When you're building the right culture, when you're creating the right programs, the compliance follows. But if you start with compliance as your focus, you design programs and practices that are more about checking a box and making sure you don't get sued, as opposed to really getting the most out of your people, making sure they're happy, helping them grow, helping them see all they can do at your company, and making sure they have a great life. I mean, in the beginning, you alluded to these are people with whole lives, right? And the things that happen to them at work impact them not only at work, but also at home. So if you're not treating people well at work, then that's going to carry over into every aspect of their life.
And I love how you mentioned that, yeah, if we have these check boxes, we almost have robotic interactions. It's not really a human to human. And my thesis is that the future of work will always be human, no matter how much AI and technology we have until, they take over, if they do. But no, I think it is important. I know it's just an assumption, but you talk about two key components. And I think the first, we can't dive too deep into because that's outside the scope of our conversation. It's probably like a whole nother podcast. Culture. How do you build culture? I like that. That in itself, we could probably go hours talking about building the right
Sure.
culture. But let's assume the listener has the right culture. It's a good place to work. You don't just have it stapled on the wall and you say, "This is our culture." You actually live it out. That's the only thing I'll touch on that. But you talk about programs, and this I think is really interesting because as a leader, I'd like to know what programs do I have to have in place and what programs do I not have in place? Like, what am I missing? Like, I'm missing out on something. Can you talk a little bit more about the programs that you think that are essential for leaders to identify or even put in place?
Yeah, so it's actually not one set of programs. I think what you have to do is look at what your business is trying to achieve, how it's trying to grow, where your people are today, and how you're going to get them to where you want them to be and where you want the business to be. And we talked earlier about there's no growth in the business without people. There's no people growth without business growth, right? So it's all connected. And so you really have to align it to make sure it works. And I mean, if you have the right culture, then all of the other things that follow from performance management or your compensation philosophy, they align to that culture and the values of your organization, and they're done in a way where it is compelling for the employee to do it, right? And what I mean by that is I don't build a performance management process that is cumbersome to use, requires hours of training for me to understand it. I take the mindset of my employees who are used to picking up a mobile app or mobile phone, downloading an app and using it right away. It's super intuitive. So we've got to bring all of that into
Hmm.
how HR builds its programs and its processes. But the programs themselves need to align to what you're trying to do as a business. So I don't think you can say, here's a set of programs that you absolutely need to
Oh
have.
yeah,
And they're going
you
to,
can't diagnose like that, right?
yeah, and you're going to have different programs depending on where you are in the company's
Hmm.
growth trajectory, right? If you're an emerging growth, smaller company, you need certain programs more, like maybe growth opportunities, performance management, that is not as let's call it as stringent as you would as in a more traditional organization where you'll have clear career paths, where you're going. You may just have some different ways of achieving those goals, so those programs also look different depending on what
Hmm.
stage you're in as a company.
That makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I want to press a little deeper because I know there
Sure.
are themes. I know there are themes, But
Yeah.
I think to recap that, let's say, for example, you have a team or a department, and within that team or department, there are some leadership potential, but the people who are leading individual teams don't have what it are potential for leaders. So it would make sense for you to create a leadership program where you can
Hmm.
help develop them, because if you help them become better, yes, you'll have better process, you'll have better leaders, but you also have more self-sufficient teams that equal better outcomes, which will eventually equal better bottom line. But let's talk about some themes, because I know that leadership is a theme. I know you can't just diagnose every business needs these things, but what should we as leaders be looking out on for business? Maybe to make it a little easier, I condense business into three different subparts. I know Peter Drucker condensed it into two: marketing and innovation. I do operations, product, and marketing. So looking at those three different areas of business, every business has that. They have operations, they have marketing, which includes sales, and they have a product or a service. Now,
Sure.
under those, how do we manage or look at areas, like if I were to do a SWOT analysis of my company or the teams that we're running, how would we be able to really identify we need to, have some people HR support here or a process? How do we come about that as leader? How do we arrive to that conclusion?
Yeah. Okay. That's a really good question. And I think you hit the nail on the head, right? You look at all three of those areas and you develop a SWOT of the strengths, of the weaknesses, of the opportunities and the threats. And that's what tells you where your people are at and what the opportunities are for you to build programs. And what you're really trying to diagnose is what are the obstacles that are preventing us in all three of those areas from getting to where we want to go. So, from an operations perspective, especially if you're in an emerging growth company, right? You kind of have to fly the plane while you fix the wing. And so a lot of times what's happening is people are fixing the wing because that's what they're good at, right? They're good at these very tactical solutions that plug a gap, but they're not good at figuring out the strategy for how do you structurally fix this, right? How do you step back and look at this at a corporate level and figure out what needs to get done? And in that case, right, we need development that helps them understand that big picture thinking, and that these tactical things that they're doing to plug these gaps is not what's going to enable the company's growth. So even from a leadership development, like Raul, I have a saying that generic programs lead to generic results, right? Like
Mhm.
you hear a lot of complaints about leadership development programs not doing their job. And the problem is you're trying to, just take all these people who have different gaps and different strengths and say, here are the things you need to learn. Well, there's two problems with that. One is you get a bunch of generic results. The second is we haven't done anything that takes the unique skills or the superpowers of that person and really helps us to dive into those and create that diversity that we're all looking for, right? We then try to build these very cookie cutter leaders who can't do very well in these dynamic
Mhm.
environments. And so I think it really is about the way I think about HR and their job right now is to get deep into those business problems, understand what's happening, and understand what we need to do from a people perspective to fix those. And it's going to vary depending on where you are as a company, who your talent is, and what they're capable of doing.
No, 100%. And I really appreciated that answer. You mentioned something that I think we have to talk in just a minute, but I do want to recap kind of like the framework that you made me think of as you explained that. And for our listeners, you can write this down. It could be an Excel sheet, it could be a piece of paper, but here's a strategy you can implement. What are your quarterly goals? Like we're recording this Q4 2021, beginning. So you can still have goals right now. What are your quarterly goals? When you have those goals, identify what are the wins from the last quarter with the team. So each goal has a certain team. So let's say you have your operations team, marketing team, product team, just to make life easy. What were the wins? What were the lessons learned is the next column. Then the next column, I think this is where we really just nailed it on the head. Where are your areas for improvement? And identifying, is this a process improvement, how we can execute better, or is this a leadership people improvement?
Mhm.
And I think with that framework, we'll be able to, kind of modernize the way that we approach HR, people development, and really nail tactical problems, but also strategic problems. But this brings me to my next question, which is a great one: cookie cutter leadership. I really love that you mentioned that. There are no cookie cutter solutions. How can we identify, or even to create a tactical leader, a leader that's dynamic, who can look at the small picture of the wing being broken and the flap or whatever, but also steer the ship? I know there's a ship in a plane, but steer the plane.
Yeah. I think I actually believe that you can't build a program that does that, right? You can't build one program that does that for everybody, but
Yeah.
you can find coaches that help people with their individual opportunities, strengths, areas of growth, especially from a leadership perspective. I think coaching is one of the most effective ways, individual coaching is one of the most effective ways for people to develop that skill set, because you're dealing with the real issue. So I actually coach a lot of HR leaders to, think more like business leaders, and where they really have success is we're looking at what's on their plate on a day-to-day basis, and I'm asking questions from a different perspective to help them think about it from another way. And I think that's what helps them say, oh yeah, I can't just keep fixing the wing. I got to get out and fly the plane, right? Or I got to make sure that I'm flying the plane and not just checking on people, checking on the passengers and handing out food, right? Like, I can take this analogy very far.
Hmm.
Um, but I think that's really the piece of it, is that we're all like, we talk about, being human. Well, everybody has different experiences, different strengths. It's really bringing in that individual coach to help them think about it from a different perspective, because then you don't lose what's so great and unique about them, right? You can
Hmm.
help them amplify that while also helping them to work on, some of the areas where they may need some more growth.
And that brings us back to like our inception, or the story that I mentioned, is individualized focus and actually caring for that person, because that's thinking outside the box, individualized attention and coaching and helping them grow. I'm going to turn the tables here and switch it a little bit. There's an interesting dynamic that I've experienced, that just by having better communications, more openness, more growth in people, you don't actually have to change the process or the strategy. They just perform better. I'm not sure how it works. I'll have to learn more about that. But you wrote a book on how a CEO can rely or must rely on their HR team to save the company. That's kind of dramatic, but I also believe it. I'd love for you to dive in a little bit more about, the book, but also the narrative and how HR actually does play such a huge role outside. You could have the best strategies in the world, but let's talk about how HR, how people really come into place here.
Yeah, so the book is called The Comeback. It was published this year. It is what I call a modern HR novel. So I think I invented a genre there. But it's a story of a private equity backed company that has a newer CEO, and gets into trouble from a competitor that starts to enter the market. And the CEO is able to get, operations, sales and marketing, et cetera, kind of shored up, but is struggling with the people side. He has a really good tactical HR leader who is just not focused on the right things. And so the way that's impacting the company is turnover is a big problem. They have a lot of open positions that they need to fill, like a head of R&D, that is impacting their ability to meet both their short-term and their long-term goals. And so this is a story about how the HR leader goes through a transformation of more of a tactical, traditional mindset in HR to a modern HR mindset. How she has to think about threats like, they're a distribution company, or they're a manufacturing and distribution company. So they get a threat from a company that's loosely disguised as Amazon taking their best talent, right? Opening up a distribution center just a few blocks away in Illinois and taking their best talent. So they've got to figure out, what are we going to do to attract and retain talent when we have all of these threats? And so it's her journey through how she makes this transition. And she's helped by a coach who is loosely disguised as me, to help her have these conversations and make this mindset shift to help the company survive this threat.
It's so dynamic, because as you were saying, that there is no way that you can escape HR in your company. It's always people, especially services driven, and there is a huge role when you have that strategy right. You'll be able to create transformations. And is this a novel, or is this based on a semi true story, taken from true events, or?
No, it is a novel.
Okay.
What I had done over the years is I had a bunch of anecdotes that I had used with potential clients to help them understand modern HR. And they were little pieces like, hey, you're always competing for talent against the tech giants, or you need to be looking at your Glassdoor rating and treating it like you would if you were a consumer company and you had Yelp ratings. And people would get it, but they wouldn't quite internalize it the way I wanted them to. So I combined all these anecdotes and data points and built this story of what was happening. And so, yeah, it's not, I'm sure a lot of people will read it and relate to it, but it wasn't based on any personal experience.
And that's the cool part too, being able to share real lessons through storytelling and kind of nailing in, because you are kind of leading the charge of shifting that mindset of an industry that's focused on the traditional path to more modern way, especially with all the dynamics that are happening with work from home, remote work, async, all that fun stuff that comes with it. So this is definitely something that I'll link in the show notes as well. But no, I think for our listeners, Annissa, what's the best place for people to go to one, thank you for this episode, but also learn a little more about you?
You can go to my website, lōglab.net, and it's got links to the book, to the services I offer, to some of my thoughts on in a blog. And so, yeah, it's the best way. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn, and then I'm on Twitter at Annissa D.
Absolutely. Put those links in the show notes. Thank you so much for being on.
Thanks for having me.